Well, the government has been accused of ignoring advice from external institutions such as the International Monetary Fund in the mid-year budget review presented last week. Now, according to tax consultancy firm PFM Tax Africa, headed by former Finance Minister Seth Terkper, the government overlooked recommendations from the fund's Article 4 consultation document a week to the presentation. Mr. Terkper joins us for a conversation around this. Good to have you, sir, tonight on Business Live. I want to pick your thoughts first on the assessment of two key institutions on the mid-year budget review. The Institute of Statistical and Social and Economic Research hopefully will play that report in the course of the bulletin, raising concerns about funding for the Ghana Cares program, which according to government is the key for economic recovery amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Plus, just as you heard, the Institute of Economic Affairs raising issues with over-concentration of expenditure on consumption, as well as the country's low tax revenue to GDP. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments. And I concur with a number of points, that were made. Yeah, we have been on a revenue policy and administration reform path. I think we need to, when we're talking about increasing revenue, let me tackle that first. You recall that GRA was created in 2009. IRS and VAT were merged into the domestic tax division, and then the tax offices were streamlined into large, medium, and small taxpayer offices. We revamped all our tax laws, all of them, about 8 or so. In fact, the including VAT, income tax, a new excise act. And then you recall that on the process itself, we did a single window with GCNet, which is now ICOMS. So the segments that were left were the strengthening of the merged IRS and VAT offices. We could have another discussion on that, Darrell. And then we also needed to automate the domestic tax offices and to integrate them, with the with the customs, system, and then use mechanisms like the national identification number, to improve, tax administration, because tax administration is not just about tax handlers. So my comment on that is these reforms have stalled. This 10-year reforms that started from 2009 stalled, from 2017. But there are indications that some of them are going to be implemented. If I may just comment on my friend Dr. Kwachi's position.
Right.
The IMF and other institutions have said that it takes about a year to 2 years to increase your tax to GDP ratio by 2 to 3%, and with a conscious effort. And so we have a long way to go, in doing that. So these are my preliminary thoughts, on the comments that had to be made. Later on, we can talk about other ones.
Okay. We didn't talk about the Ghana Cares program. I don't know if you want to wade into that as well.
Oh, yes. Well, okay. That was going to be part of the main discussion. But yes, it's very difficult. Indeed, some of us have been on record on the expansionary expenditures, including, some are politically difficult to discuss. They are very tough, because they are popular. And that includes the free SHS, as well as other government programs, which is taking so much. We also know that interest payment and compensation is taking, we are talking about interest payment, not debt service. So interest payment, that is the interest before you talk about amortization or repayment of principal. It's taking so much. In fact, it's consuming all of our tax revenue, those two items. And so if adjustments were made, even there was no supplementary, but you will notice that the adjustments that were made to avoid a supplementary, which is one of the things we mentioned, was simply to take from, from other areas, in particular the COVID expenses, surprisingly, to increase the payment of wages and, and expenditure. wages and allowances. Now, I'm highlighting this because wages, interest payments, and to a large extent, and the whole of other recurrent expenditure is what you call principal consumption. That is because they are annual, and that's why we call it recurrent or current expenditure. It's something you have to pay annually. So if our tax revenue is not covering these items, then it means we are borrowing. We are borrowing to finish paying those three items, and then we are borrowing to repay the loans, and we are borrowing for capital expenditure. So this is the context in which you have to understand, those who are saying, let us look at, the weight of consumption, on the budget. When you talk about consumption, it doesn't mean that you are saying that it is not important. No, not at all. But what you are saying is that the budget needs a balance. The principle is that all your recurrent expenditure ideally should come from your current taxes. And I use taxes, as I always say, not total revenue, because our taxes are also earmarked, heavily earmarked. And so the difference, which is grants, is also been dwindling, and income and fees. We have IGF and statutory funds and others, and so realistically, what we are doing is that and that's why the debt is rising. And it brings into fore the other point that was raised. How do you treat, the energy, and the bank bailout costs in the background of ISSER? We'll come back to that. So I agree totally, that we need to rebalance the budget, which was the theme of our 2015 budget, if you recall. When we experienced some of these same challenges, if you recall, single spine, and other power challenges and others on the economy. So yes, a rebalancing is needed in that respect. Otherwise, we would be borrowing, we are not just covering, the consumption with our tax and other revenues. We are actually borrowing, for consumption. And like a household, as I always say, or a business, as I always say, a household, if you continue to spend everything on food, clothing, and the rest, you cannot buy your furniture. And if you are even rich, you cannot buy your car, you cannot build your house. You have to sacrifice consumption.
And on the subject of borrowing, our debt keeps rising. And so today, we are getting indication that the IMF is suggesting that the country may have to come back to it for some sort of support. Now, your institution is accusing government about that.
Well, the full report, I'm not sure it's out yet. What we use, actually was the table that was attached, to the press release, which is out. So we are yet to even dissect the full report. And the IMF, for example, stated that the deficit at the end of 2020, was 15%. They indicated that our debt was 79%. And yesterday you would notice that, the end 2020 debt figures were repeated as they were in the 2020 budget. The debt numbers, the deficit and the debt numbers, were repeated as if nothing had happened. The IMF revised where we had zero, for bailout costs and the rest, and relegated them, to appendix memorandum items in the appendices to the budget. The IMF has showed it. They isolate it, but they add it in calculating the deficit. And this is the point that we have been making for a very long time. But let me state that, and the point on which we made these, assertions are that, one, the IMF Article 4 is an obligation of all countries that are members of the IMF. Therefore, you can Google, you can let your producers Google, and we educate Ghanaians. The US has an Article 4. Germany has an Article 4, all the EU countries, from advanced to fragile, because they'll be back and you are obliged. Now, the second point we made is that the government gives consent for the publication of these reports. The government is consulted. You recall that they were in town in March, or I believe they did a lot of it through Zoom in March, and they released a preliminary statement, if you recall, which said that the deficit was 13%, and at the time they put the debt at about 74 or so. So government was consulted. Now, by the time they completed their report between March and July, which is when the budget was, the media review was being done, they had revised these figures, particularly in increasing the amount, bailout costs and the rest. Now, if the government did not have these discussions, did not consent, they will not come out. IMF program, you do the adjustment. That's why you have the revised, budget line. But let me add quickly also that this is not the first time. In fact, in 2019, the 2019 Article 4 was published in December when Parliament was debating the 2020 budget. And there was no budget, no mention of the adjustment. So this is not the first time. And there was and then later on there was a COVID, loan request, which stated that the economy may have a gap, of about 6%. And COVID, the real cost of COVID was 10%, right? And so, and again, these were ignored, and they were ignored all the year round through 2020 and 2021, and everything was being attributed, to COVID. Real gap of about 3 to 6%. Now, the IMF has a win COVID, globally, and the fact that we do not have vaccinations. Why do I say this? If you look at adjustments that were made, despite the critical nature of COVID, the revenue or the monies that are being held for COVID were cut to increase the payment of wages. It's in Appendix 3 of the budget. You can check it for yourself. So do we really need the COVID loan and the COVID assistance and others, or we do not? And if we have excess money, why don't we generate taxes to pay, the wages, and allowances? Again, I'm not saying they are not important. And then we return or we repay the COVID loan so that it can lower, the debt. So I urge professionals to look critically, at some of these happenings that are, buried, somewhere, in the budget.
It looks like for political reasons, government may be a bit hesitant to go to the IMF for support, but it looks quite inevitable that we may actually really need the IMF to support us. What would you advise government to do? What's your start on this? To go back or not?
To say yes or no, right? Because to be a standby. And then as happens, then the attack is that Setakwe says we should go to IMF. No. But I'm putting the context. First, I spoke about IMF and Article 4. Whether you like it or not, they will tell your Ghanaians, what you told them, and we should represent it. Even if we're in a program, it would have come out. Secondly, that if you compared the zero coupon bond that we did, which is actually taking a loan, discounting it, and then suspending the repayment to 2025 for the next administration, hopefully the NDC. Sorry for that. What you have done is you have discounted a loan of about 500, collected just about 300,
right?
Which would have allowed us to with assistance of the World Bank and the African Development Bank and multilateral agencies and the big bilateral institutions that give us grants and the rest, would have refinanced, basically done the same refinancing, maybe on better terms, than what we did. So this is a context in which, with interest rates taking so much, we are borrowing to pay part of interest, we are borrowing to repay our loan. Yes, the IMF is the lender of last resort, and the IMF is the one that is listened to by the markets and the rest. So if you want to go and borrow, by now they are reading the IMF, they'll be reading the IMF Article 4 report when it is released, more than our media review. Because remember, Fitch, just a point, I know you want to remember, Fitch, Moody's, and the rest have downgraded. These are the very institutions that are going to rate our bonds. So where are we going to get the money when these institutions, not just the IMF, remember the World Bank has spoken about debt, African Development Bank, and we are defying all of this. And even where they say that our debt is at a certain figure, we are saying it is not, and we are pointing out to old numbers.
I think I can deduce your answer to the question from your submission. Thank you so much, Mr. Tekwe. I guess we may have to continue with this conversation another time. We are grateful really for your time tonight.